A very warm welcome ahead of the launch of the 2023 IRMSA risk report. I'm in conversation now with renowned energy expert Chris Yelland. My name is Jeremy Maggs. Now, with a deep understanding of the energy landscape and years of experience in the field, Chris is a highly respected voice in the industry. And we are going to be discussing, I think, one of, if not the most pressing concerns facing South Africa right now, the debilitating load shedding crisis that we're all experiencing in one way or another, and the associated risks. So let's get straight to it. Chris, as an expert in the field of energy, is going to shed some light on the risks, as I've already mentioned, but perhaps more importantly, how the wider community should be approaching this critical issue. So Chris, let's wade straight in if we can. Right now, as we speak, do you think that we have a better handle on the problem, a worse handle on the problem, or are we just muddling our way through?
Well, and I think let's start off by saying, what is the problem? What is load shedding, actually? And it's really a mismatch between supply and demand. So supply and demand always has to be in balance. And if you don't have enough supply to meet demand, you've got a problem. If demand is higher than supply, you've got a problem, and you've got to reduce demand, or you've got to increase supply so that they're brought back into balance. And so with that in mind, do we have a problem, and do we have a handle on this problem? Well, we obviously have a problem, because we have had up to stage 6 load shedding for very extended periods. And that means we've had to reduce demand by 6,000 megawatts, which is a very significant amount. And that has resulted in loss of power for up to 8 hours a day by customers of electricity. Now, I mean, do we have a handle on the problem? I don't think we've got a handle on it yet, but we're beginning to get a handle on it. So I think at last, it's starting to really hurt. And it has really woken up the politicians, especially as there's a general election coming up next year. And I think this new urgency is really driven ultimately not by the damage it's doing to the economy, but the damage it's doing politically in the forthcoming elections. And that's a real wake-up call for the ANC, a wake-up call for government. And I think they're now starting to take the matter with more seriousness, appointing a Minister of Electricity, President's action plan to end load shedding, which was announced last year in July 2022. And I think have been moving too slowly, even since then. But I think the problem is becoming very pressing now after several months, almost continuously, of stage 6 load shedding. When we first had load shedding stage 6 in December 2019, it was something unheard of. And it caused the president to be recalled from Egypt. It caused a risk mitigation, independent power producer procurement program, and emergency procurement, which has never really happened. But now we've experienced the stage 6 for many, many months. And I think this is now where government is starting to realize that they have to take action. Otherwise, they will be punished at the elections.
Chris, there's absolutely no doubt that stage 6 is hurt, but let's get to the elephant in the room right up front before we focus this conversation on the broader risk community. There's been so much talk about a national grid failure, everything coming to a halt, 2 weeks to start up the grid again, and the resultant consequences if that happened. Are we We're close to that? There have been so many divergent opinions. Let's get the view of an expert.
Yeah, I mean, we heard just recently Julius Malema, head of the EFF, saying that we were on the brink of a national blackout. It's not true. It is false. It is the kind of political rhetoric that is dangerous. And it's not true. And let me try and explain why. First of all, I'm often asked, is the risk of a national blackout now, while we're having the stage 6 load shedding or stage 4 load shedding, is the risk of a national blackout now higher than what it was in 2008? When we first had load shedding, not at stage 6 level. And I would say that we are better prepared now than we were in 2008. In other words, the risk of load shedding, of a national blackout then, was much higher than it is now. Why? Because we are very well experienced now. We have got load shedding schedules. There are protocols in place through these load shedding schedules and many other measures that Eskom have put in place. The levers that is at their disposal have been carefully planned, put into protocols, documented, and practiced. We practice load shedding every day. And we have become very skilled at this. In 2008, we didn't even have load shedding schedules. When supply exceeded demand and we couldn't deal with the problem, there was chaos. The mining industry shut down because we were ill prepared and ill practiced. So I think we're in a better position now. And the second thing I want to say is people tend to think that the stage of load shedding we're at is an indicator of how close we are to a national blackout. In other words, the higher the stage load shedding we are, the closer we are to a national blackout. Actually, that is not true at all. When you've had stage 6 load shedding for many hours, days, even weeks or months, what it means is by doing stage 6 load shedding, by shedding 6,000 megawatts, you have now brought supply and demand back into balance by having stage 6. There is now no more risk of a load shedding, of a national blackout. The risk of a national blackout is when there is a sudden drop in supply or a sudden increase in demand that you don't respond to. In other words, you don't take the necessary action to bring supply and demand in balance. Now, there are a whole load of levers to bring supply and demand into balance. Some of them are fairly slow responses that requiring human intervention. Others are automatic responses that occur automatically within a fraction of a second, or within a second, or within 10 seconds. Now, that is much faster than humans can respond to this. So those are automatic levers that come into play if load shedding is taking too long. Then these automatic things will step in. So what I'm really just saying is the fact that we have stage 6 load shedding for an extended period of time means that supply and demand is back in balance, and then there's no more risk of a national blackout. It's when they are not in balance and you don't do anything about it, then there's a risk of a national blackout.
So, Chris, let's nail this one on the head if we can. In terms of risk management and risk planning, is a national blackout something that risk managers should be looking at, or is it something they can safely take off the table for the time being?
Okay, so I'm not a risk management specialist. The members of the Institute of Risk Management, these are professionals in this business. But in my simple mind, risk is a combination of two factors. The first factor is the probability of an event. And the second factor that makes up risk is the consequences of that event. So you may have a low probability event with low consequences. That's not a risk, not a high risk. But you can have a low probability event with very high consequences. That may be a high risk event. Even though it's a low probability event, the consequences are so big that insurance companies who are in the risk business have decided that they're not going to cover that risk because the risk is too big for them. The financial risk, which is what they cover, and they have actuaries to work out financial risk, and they figure out that they are unable to cover the risk of a national blackout. That's why we see today insurance companies excluding the national blackout and its consequences from cover in their policies. And we've seen this from a number of major insurance and reinsurance companies. So if you were to say, is there a risk of a national blackout? Of course there's a risk. It is so high, the risk is so high that insurance companies don't want to cover you. Is the probability of this high? No, it's a very low probability event, but it happens to be a very high consequence. And the combination, probability and consequence, is such that it makes it a high risk event. Risky enough that A, insurance companies are not prepared to provide you risk cover. And B, I mean, Eskom have got detailed plans, not only in how to prevent a national blackout, but how to recover from a national blackout as quickly as possible. They have got detailed plans in place. Banks, through the Banking Association of South Africa, are starting to take a very careful look industry-wide as to what would happen if there was a national blackout to the banking and financial sector. And what are they doing to mitigate that risk? In other words, they see this, even though it's a low probability event, it's a risk that they have to consider. And they have to have emergency plans in place. So if Eskom has got emergency plans in place, the Banking Association have got emergency plans in place, the telecommunications industry, I'm talking about the cell phone networks, the telecoms networks, the fiber backbone of South Africa, if they're all starting to think about contingency plans in the event of a national blackout, doesn't mean to say it's a high probability event, but you have to also plan for low probability, high consequence events. You have to do emergency planning to be prepared, because it can happen, even though it's a low probability. So now the question is, should business be preparing for these events? I would say they should be starting to thinking about it. They should start thinking, in my business, what would it mean if I went without power for 2 weeks? And what mitigation measures could I take in such an eventuality? And is it worth taking them? So I think people in business should be starting to think of these things, because Eskom thinks about it. The banking industry thinks about it. The telecoms industry thinks about it. And if you're in the food industry, you maybe think you should start thinking about it. And in fact, every business, I think, should be thinking about it. Not that I'm trying to be alarmist, not that I'm saying it's a high probability event. It is a low probability event. That doesn't mean to say you shouldn't think about it carefully.
So what would 2 weeks without power look like?
Well, okay, we just have to think this thing through. And by the way, a national blackout, if it occurs, it's not something that goes for 2 weeks without power and then suddenly the power is back on. In the case of a national blackout, efforts will be taken to start restoring power, within an hour or two. And depending on the situation in South Africa, it could either take a week or two to bring the power system back up to normal again, or in worst case scenarios, maybe 3 to 4 weeks. So there are 3 different scenarios that one might look at, perhaps a pessimistic scenario, a realistic scenario, and an optimistic scenario, and try and figure out what this means. But just let's think about it. If you were without power for more than a few days, batteries in laptops and home batteries and in these machines, credit card machines, and in ATMs and in telecoms towers, these batteries would go flat within actually a lot less than a day. Your cell phone batteries would go flat. Within a few days, it is likely that those sites, could be telecom sites and others that have diesel backup generators, could run out of diesel. And so you can imagine an environment where there's no lights at night, where there's no phones, you can't communicate, radio and TV, no more radio and TV, no more water in the taps, because the pumps don't have electricity to pump water into the reservoirs. So the reservoirs run out of water. No water. You couldn't draw money at a cash machine at an ATM. Those wouldn't work. So there would be no cash. You wouldn't be able, therefore, to buy food. Shops would be shut. They can't sell things, credit card, cash, problem. And you wouldn't be able to get petrol. The petrol pumps wouldn't be operational. So I think you can imagine in these circumstances of no water, no food, no power, no telecommunications, no cash, no petrol, that there would be in the darkness severe social unrest, looting on a massive scale, not just in Durban, not just in Gauteng, but across the country. There would be desperate people in need of food and water and money, and so we can expect that kind of unrest. That is, if this would last for a week or 2 or 3. The consequences are obviously very, very severe. And one's got to think about these circumstances and what one would do, at least in one's own business, in one's own house, in one's own company, mitigation measures. At least think about them.
Chris, in the here and now then, as far as the risk community is concerned, do they need to be looking at stage 6, which we're currently experiencing right now, but they should perhaps be cognizant of the fact that it could go to stage 8, particularly during the winter months of 2023? That's the immediate concern, isn't it?
Well, traditionally, if you were to look at the load shedding patterns over the last few years, in fact, the winter is not the worst load shedding period. It's sort of, people tend to think that winter must be worse than summer, and that because there is an increase of demand in winter. But it hasn't always been that case. And in fact, we're experiencing it right now, as the onset of winter month, June, July and August. June is the first winter month. Those 3 months, we suddenly experienced a reduction of load shedding. If you were to look at when did the first stage 6 load shedding happen? It happened in December 2019. So we mustn't think that the winter months are necessarily the worst. And there's a number of reasons for that. First of all, on the demand side, people think, demand is increasing in winter. And it does to some extent. There is more domestic demand in winter. But in the 3 winter months, the price of electricity triples for large energy-intensive, energy-guzzling companies. And that is a significant price signal to them to reduce demand. And many of the large smelters actually shut down over the 3 winter months. They cannot afford to operate. They stockpile their product before the winter months. They shut down during the winter months to do maintenance, and they draw on their stockpiles, then they start up again in summer. So there's a significant reduction in industrial and in energy-intensive demand during the winter months. And that to some extent at least offsets the increase of domestic demand due to the cold weather. So keep that in mind. Demand is not as high as one would think in winter. Secondly, in winter, supply increases. So remember, load shedding is caused by the imbalance of supply and demand. So if you can reduce demand and push up supply, you can be in balance and not need load shedding. And of course, so why is supply better in winter? Well, Eskom do a lot of their maintenance in summer so that their plant is ready for the winter months. It's been maintained, it's been prepared, and it's ready to meet this period. And so you find that there's more availability because the machines are in better condition in the winter months. Secondly, if you were to look at the energy availability factor, it always improves in winter. In other words, there's more available generation. And another reason for that, besides the better performance of the plant in winter, is that the generators actually perform better in cold weather. They call this, in hot weather, they cannot generate as much electricity as in cold weather. It's to do with the cooling of power stations. And so, they also do less maintenance in winter. By doing less maintenance, you've got more generators available to do work. The more maintenance you do, the less generators you've got available. So the combination of those three factors means that supply in winter is better than the supply in summer. And you see this because the availability factor in summer always increases in winter and it drops off in summer. So there's an increase in supply in winter, and demand to some extent is not as high as it used to be, as it could be, because of the high pricing signal. And lastly, there's a lot of people now switching to renewable energy and batteries, domestic users, farms, small businesses, commerce. This is relieving the grid. So as years go by, more and more self-generation is occurring. And so this is helping relieve the burden on Eskom. And so we're seeing that the load shedding, people say that in winter months, we're going to hit stage 8 load shedding. Not necessarily. Not if you look at the history. But that's not to say that it couldn't happen. It's just, I think it's unlikely we're going to hit stage 8 this winter. That's my personal view.
Well, that is a little bit of light at the end of the tunnel, or a bit of a silver lining. But you did, Chris Yelland, talk about self-generation. So when it comes back to risk planning, should the risk community be taking self-generation and off-the-grid solution a lot more seriously? Surely that now needs to be first and foremost when it comes to planning.
Indeed. But I just want to clarify something you said. You talked about off the grid. I don't think from a risk point of view, anybody should be thinking of going off the grid. And by that, I mean telling Eskom to take its supply and stick it, or telling your municipality to take their supply and stick it. No, what you should be doing is putting in what they call a grid-tied system. In other words, another backup system in parallel with the grid. But please do not throw away your grid connection. It's a very important risk mitigation technique, and one should have multiple risk mitigation techniques and not throw out the baby with the bathwater. But to answer your question, I think every business today, if you're looking at business continuity, if you're a small business in a home, if you're in an office park, if you're in a complex, a business complex, or if you have your own building, I think every business is starting to think about business continuity and resilience, and is looking at what they can do. And usually it's a combination of a few things. Solar PV and battery storage is very useful. It helps contain costs. It helps reduce your carbon footprint. It gives you additional resilience and business continuity. But you may also need a petrol or diesel backup generator that you would use to the least extent possible. But you got it when you need it. And you may not need it for many hours in the year. Therefore, it won't cost you very much in diesel over a whole year. But when you need it, you need it. And it's a useful backup that doesn't cost, when it's not operating, the running costs are essentially zero. So a combination of a grid supply, a solar PV system, a battery storage facility, and a backup generator. That is what you might call a microgrid. In other words, for your building, for your office park, you can have a microgrid which is designed to operate in a very seamless way to firstly minimize your cost of electricity from the grid. In other words, to use solar PV as your first option. And if the sun goes behind a cloud, or if it's a rainy day, you switch over to battery. That's your second option. Your third option is your grid supply. And your last resort, because it is the most expensive, is your diesel backup. Hopefully, whilst it's expensive to run, you only have to run, for very few hours in the year because you've got these other backups. And that gives you a high degree of resilience. Of course, not every company can do that. It's very suitable for home users, for what I call commercial businesses and farmers, agricultural sector. It's not so, it's not appropriate, or not as appropriate for very large energy intensive industry. They cannot have a diesel backup for their whole industry. They can only have a diesel backup for the emergency part of their business. So you've got to look at every business on its own, but every business should be looking at resilience and business continuity, because load shedding is going to be with us for several years still. Maybe not at the same intensity as it has been, but it's not going to disappear altogether all of a sudden.
Chris, I'm wondering if there are potential risks associated with implementing alternative energy source solutions.
Well, in a way, any piece of equipment has to be maintained and kept in good order. But I don't think this is a complicated business. A solar PV system and a battery storage system, there are no moving parts. This is not stuff that requires complex operation and maintenance. Of course, it requires maintenance. You've got to make sure that your batteries are in good condition. But again, these days, battery systems come with quite sophisticated battery management software that protects that battery from abuse, in terms of not letting it charge too quickly, not letting it discharge too quickly. Sometimes some batteries don't like to discharge fully to zero. So you monitor the battery and you make sure that it never discharges to zero. So the battery management systems today go a long way to ensuring that you don't abuse your battery, that it's operated within its specifications. Solar PV systems are reliable and proven, and one can get a long life out of solar PV panels. Batteries tend to have a life of typically 8 to 10 years. Yeah, you have to replace them at a certain point. But I don't think there are major risks. And one thing that people are look, there are tech people that like tech stuff. They like, looking after their battery and their inverter, and they've got an app on their cell phone and all of that. But I think most people, don't want to climb on their roof and clean panels on a weekend. They don't want to really own a PV battery inverter system. They might want to rent it. They might want to lease it over a period to buy. They might want to contract with a service provider that looks after it for them. And in the ultimate situation, and it's not far off, you have what is called aggregators. What do you really want as a domestic user? I don't think many domestic users have the resources and the tech ability to really maintain their system. Wouldn't it be nice to just be able to rent out your roof space to an aggregator company, and you earn some passive income for sitting on your stoop, drinking your Jalapeño wine, earning some passive income whilst an aggregator puts this on your roof. It's not your system, it's his system. He's got to maintain it. He's got to look after it. It's got nothing to do with you. And he gives you a special deal on your electricity price. So you earn some passive income, you get a special electricity price from him, and he owns the system. And he can own hundreds, if not thousands, of rooftops across a city, across warehouses, factories, parking lots, etc. And that aggregator can now remote control, dispatch electricity when the utility, when city power needs, when they have a peak period where they pay a lot of money to Eskom for electricity. If they could suddenly start using this power stored in the batteries at that time, between 4 o'clock and 7 o'clock in the evening, and to be able to control what is on your roof. Now, you can do all of this with modern technology. So I think that is the way to go ultimately, and it also mitigates the risk to the user. You get the benefits without the risk.
Another risk management suggestion is public-private partnership and more cross-sector or cross-business or cross-community collaboration to mitigate risk and the impact of load shedding. You've alluded to it in your last answer, but do you think that that is an accelerated direction that we will be moving in?
Yes, I do think so, because one of the biggest risks we face, well, I mentioned two of what I consider the big risks in the electricity supply industry at the moment. One is our overdependence on Eskom. Right now, Eskom is generating about 94% of all the electricity in South Africa. It's of all the generators in South Africa, it generates 94. That means all your eggs are in one basket, and that basket is failing. Eskom is not a sustainable business. It's not really a going concern. It is only a going concern because the shareholder bails it out to the tune of about 50 billion rand a year. It's not self-sustaining. And one of the ways to mitigate risk is to diversify. And I don't think Eskom is going to disappear. I think it's always going to be a big player. But I think there should be a lot more players in this field, and that's the way it's moving. And we're going to see a move from a generation sector that is dominated by Eskom to a much more diversified sector where you have former Eskom power stations as generators, where you have public-private partnerships as generators, where you have municipalities as generators, whether you have, there already are over 100, and we could probably expect several hundred independent power producers, and literally thousands and thousands and thousands of small generators. In other words, domestic, commercial, industrial, mining, agricultural, farmers, all generating into this common pool, the so-called grid company, and through an electricity market, distributing electricity to customers around the country. So what I'm just trying to say is to manage this risk of a single buyer and a single generator. Diversification is a necessary option, and it's already happening, and public-private partnerships are part of that. But there's a second risk that needs to be faced, and that is our heavy overdependence on coal as a primary energy source. Today, about 80% of the electricity generated in South Africa comes from coal. This is a huge risk facing South Africa because it's a risk to our economy, because our products will no longer be able to be exported because of their high carbon footprint, and countries in the European Union and elsewhere are going to be introducing what they call cross-border adjustment tariffs, which will penalize products like aluminium produced in South Africa from electricity generated by coal. They will face tariffs. They will not be able to sell their products overseas because they're priced out of the market. So our overdependence on coal in a world that is looking to reduce our carbon intensity, reduce our carbon footprint, we've got one of the highest carbon footprints in the world today in South Africa. That's a risk. And of course, one has to mitigate that risk by diversifying to alternative sources. We do not need more coal-fired power in South Africa. We've got too much. We need less power and more of the other stuff. Solar, wind, battery storage, hydro, pump storage, to a small extent gas. But we don't need more coal. We need less coal.
So, Chris, adding to what you've already told us, we've also got to take into account when it comes to risk management, the whole notion of the social fabric of society and just how sensitive people are, how worried, how scared people are, and how the electricity crisis can play into those fears with a very real consequence.
I think you've hit a very important nail on the head, and that is, I think the social fabric in South Africa right now is very delicate as a result of very high levels of unemployment, inequality, and what is the third one? Inequality.
Poverty.
Poverty. Yeah, so very high levels of poverty, inequality, and Jesus, I'm getting confused now.
Poverty, inequality, unemployment.
And unemployment. Yeah, the three major issues facing society. And if we underestimate poverty, if we underestimate inequality and these issues and unemployment, we really could be setting ourselves up for failure. We've seen those riots that took place in Durban and in Gauteng, and it didn't take much of a spark to get that going. Now, electricity, we in the cities and in Sandton, we complain, but I can assure you in the rural areas and in the townships, electricity supply is significantly worse. And it is, I think, something that we need to take note of, that there is significant discontent on the ground in these poor areas about feelings of neglect. Of course, it goes beyond just electricity. It goes to water, housing, and other services. But electricity is a big part of it. Poorer areas face very high levels of electricity theft and non-payment. And Eskom does what they call load reduction, which is there to protect their assets, their distribution assets, because they become heavily overloaded due to illegal connections at certain times of the day. So Eskom do additional load shedding called load reduction in these areas where there are high levels of theft and non-payment and overloading of assets. And in the end, this can cause a flashpoint, social flashpoint, driven by these three factors: poverty, unemployment, and inequality. And so I think we just got to be very, very aware of these as additional risks that cannot be ignored.
Chris, I want to bring the conversation to a close, and you have already alluded to the fact that load shedding is going to be with us for the foreseeable future. But considering the evolving nature of the energy landscape, as you've just outlined to the risk community, what then do you believe the future holds in terms of managing risks associated with this problem?
Yeah, I think customers need to start taking ownership of their own energy future. The days of a centralized electricity utility are not over, but are changing. And I think it's something that all customers should be looking to becoming part of the solution. And you know, if you think that you can just rely on government for everything and Eskom for your electricity, you're wrong. And that trend is not just happening in South Africa, it's happening globally. So customers need to start taking ownership of their own future. They need to become generators in their own right. And they need not off-grid, on-grid. And the future of electricity, actually, I think Eskom as a utility, at the moment, it has three parts: generation, transmission, and distribution, but it's dominated by generation. Generation is the big business of Eskom. I think the future Eskom is going to be dominated by transmission, the grid. The grid is a platform that enables the transport of electricity from generators, multiple generators, thousands of generators, big, medium, and small. The grid is the platform that transports the electricity from the point of generation to the point of consumption. people that are currently consumers of electricity will become what is known as a prosumer. They are both a producer of electricity as well as a consumer of electricity. They can generate power into the grid. They can also consume power from the grid. And the grid becomes the important platform of the future. And I see the utility Eskom morphing over time to be, it may not even be called Eskom anymore, but it's the transmission part of Eskom. Whatever you call it, it's irrelevant what you call it. Those old assets of old power stations, they're not going to disappear, but their ownership may change. But they'll still be there until the end of their life. It's just a rearrangement of the deck chairs to become more efficient, modern, and flexible to meet the changing requirements of electricity. So the electricity sector, I see, is in for some very exciting times, some very significant changes, and we are kind of in the middle of it. There are risks in this whole process. One of the biggest risks, I think, is political, because in government, in the ANC, in the top 7, in the cabinet, not everybody is on the same page. There are people who are thinking about a restructured electricity and a market-orientated electricity sector, and that's what I believe in. But there are other people who are backward-looking and look to the vertically integrated monopoly of the past, and they think that Eskom should go back to the past. And they talk about returning Eskom to its former glory. There is no going back. The world has changed. We need to be forward-looking. We shouldn't be dreaming impossible thoughts about restoring Eskom to be a utility of, to its former glory. We should be thinking of how do we restructure Eskom to become a utility of the future, not a utility of the past. The world is changing, and Eskom and the electricity supply industry has to change. Right now, Eskom is structured as it was set up 100 years ago. It's not appropriate anymore. Its peers, Telkom, ISCOR, Sasol, these old state-owned enterprises are all listed on the stock exchange today. Many of them are multinational companies. I mean, you look at ISCOR, it's now ArcelorMittal, Kumba, and Exxaro. 3 different companies, all listed on the stock exchange, all of them major players in their own right. But Eskom is like it was 100 years ago. It's a dinosaur in the modern world. It needs to change, and we need to, but the risk is that people don't think properly. They think of the past and not the future. And the politicians in South Africa, there is not consensus. And when there is no consensus, things don't move forward. You need to have consensus to move in the right direction. We could be moving forward, but we could take a big step backwards, depending on the political play out. And that's a big risk for me. For the electricity supply industry, it depends on the level of political consensus to move in the right direction.
Chris, on behalf of the IRMSA risk community, I want to thank you for a sober reality check, but also for a positive glimpse at the future as well. Thank you for your valuable insights on the current load shedding crisis, and also the approach that the risk community has got to think about adopting. Chris Yelland, thank you very much indeed.